What's happening, Packer fans? Welcome into the Pack a Day podcast here on YouTube. My name is Andy Herman. You can follow me on Twitter at Andy Herman NFL. So, not exactly a busy Monday. One more free agent cornerback came off the board. Adoree Jackson signed with the New York Giants, which I think was expected the last couple days. He had spent time in New York. He was supposed to go to Philly. He didn't go to Philly. He had started following a bunch of New York Giants on Instagram, which isn't always 100% tell, but it's pretty telling nonetheless. And of course, he got paid in free agency by the Giants to kind of get him in New York and kind of finalize their free agent class. There's no way Green Bay was going to be in on a 3-year, $39 million deal, 13 mil per season with a bunch guaranteed. There's just no way Green Bay was going to be in on that. But nonetheless, another cornerback comes off the board. And I know some people have been asking me, well, the Broncos have been signing, a couple cornerbacks this free agency period. And with all these corners going off the board, does this mean that maybe some of the top corners will fall in the draft? And I don't necessarily think so. Like a team like the Giants, yeah, if you spend a ton of money for 3 seasons of Adoree Jackson, I think that may take you out of the cornerback, position maybe in the first round. A team like the Broncos, they've got Bryce Callahan, who's in the last year of his deal. They signed Kyle Fuller, but only to a 1-year deal. Maybe they're a little less likely to take a corner in the first round, but you're drafting, again, especially if you're the Broncos, you're not drafting to win a Super Bowl this season. You're definitely drafting for the future and long term with both Bryce Callahan and Kyle Fuller coming off the books next season. I think that certainly keeps them in the running for cornerback. I think most of the corners signed this season, I still think you have to keep an eye towards the future for teams that are, picking at the top of the draft. So I don't know that it changes too much, maybe a little. And certainly the depth of the cornerback position could lead some of those teams to maybe saying, you know what, we don't need a Surtain or a Horn or a Newsome in the first round. We're going to go grab the depth at the cornerback position in the second round. And maybe that does allow somebody like a Greg Newsome Jr. to fall to 29 to Green Bay. Only time will tell, but it will be interesting. But nonetheless, another cornerback off the market for Green Bay potentially at that position. So what does that mean moving forward? We'll see. There's still obviously some corners left, and it's definitely a position that I would expect them to attack very aggressively in the draft. I was talking to Aaron Egler on Cheesehead TV on Monday about where things are at with the cornerback position. And the truth of the matter is, especially now that Adoree Jackson's off the board, the difference in talent between the cornerbacks that will be in free agency right now and the corners that'll be available once the draft is over is probably fairly minimum. And you can make an argument that, hey, let's wait and see what happens in the draft first. And then if we're still really leaky at the cornerback position, all right, let's make sure that we make a trade or sign somebody in that's still available at that point. I don't, again, the difference between an AJ Bouye and a Quentin Dunbar and a whomever else that's still on the list is just not that great. So Casey Hayward, so on and so forth. It's a bunch of 30-year-old guys who didn't play well last year or are on the decline or were injured. It's, you're not getting a premium corner at this point in time. So I easily could see a scenario where Green Bay sees what they can get in the draft. If they feel like they've adequately addressed the position, maybe they leave with a Greg Newsome Jr. and then, maybe somebody a little bit later in the draft. And then, they feel comfortable with their roster along with Jair and Josh Jackson, KB Anento and Kadar Hallman. Maybe they're going to let those guys fight it out in camp. We'll see. But definitely slim pickings at the cornerback position at this point in time. So what I wanted to do today, of course, we are now a full week in past, the start of the legal tampering period, and Green Bay and Tampa remain the 2 teams that have not signed a free agent. So I figured I would go through, because it's still fun to talk about free agency, right? I figured I would go through position by position and maybe some names out there in free agency that Green Bay still could target. And I'm going to be transparent with you and upfront with you. Again, I try to be as realistic as possible whenever I can. Sometimes I'll go off and fantasy land because it's fun to do so. But for the most part, this is going to be rather realistic. And I think that's what I'm really shooting for today. What are some realistic options? And there's a couple outside of the box options at each position that I'll give you. I'll give you a couple names that I really like that I think Green Bay could target. But for the most part, this is going to be a realistic list. And what that means is there's going to be a lot of names on here that maybe you haven't even heard of or don't know of or certainly haven't been thinking about. If you're hoping that this is going to be a list of Richard Shermans and, those type of players, Jadeveon Clowney's, It's just not going to be. So I'm sorry, but these are some realistic names that I think Green Bay could target at each position through the remainder of free agency. So let's start at quarterback. And I've talked about this a little bit already in a few episodes ago. The most realistic option for Green Bay to target in free agency is an undrafted free agent at quarterback. They need to fill out the back end of that room. Aaron Rodgers and Jordan Love are going to get all the snaps. You bring in a couple camp arms. You hope you hit on one of them as a developmental guy like they did with Tim Boyle. So I think that's the most realistic. I could see them maybe taking a shot at like a Kirk Benkert, who has some talent. He's been oft injured. He's athletic. It's basically almost like an older, talented guy who's had a cup of coffee in the league. I could maybe somebody like that to fill out the room just in case you don't get anyone in the draft or an undrafted free agency that you really like. He could be a camp arm that has a little bit of upside. As I mentioned the other day, two players like a Brian Hoyer or a Chase Daniel, I'm not even necessarily saying keep him on the roster, and certainly not anything above that minimum. Josh McCown, same sort of thing. But I do think that there is value in having a quarterback like that in camp with Aaron Rodgers and Jordan Love. And even if you do keep him on the roster through the season, is it an ideal way to spend a 53-man roster spot? It's not. It's probably not. But there is absolute value in having a quarterback in that room. We know that Aaron Rodgers likes to be challenged with those quizzes and those different coverages and all that. Well, Josh McCown, a Brian Hoyer, a Chase Daniel is going to be able to do that better than what a Jordan Love would as a backup. So there's value for Aaron Rodgers. And then Aaron Rodgers has no time to mentor a Jordan Love. He's trying to win a Super Bowl, maybe another MVP, and keep this team running, right? So having a guy in that locker room like a Chase Daniel or a Brian Hoyer to really just take Jordan Love under their wing and mentor him and spend all that time, effort, and energy, I think there's value in that as well. So nothing below a vet min or above a vet min, but I do think there could be some value for a player like that in free agency if they wanted to go that route. Running back, a couple realistic options. I still think Tyler Ervin makes sense to bring back, and I do think James White makes some sense as well. He's a very good pass catching back, as you all know. He was not great in pass protection this last year, but it's been something he's been very good at throughout the course of his career. He's been used in some short yardage situations, more in kind of surprise type situations, but overall, he's just a good, solid football player, the kind of guy that you can win with. And I think you've got your grinder and AJ Dillon. You've got your every down back in Aaron Jones. Now you've kind of got a receiving option and James White and somebody that can come in. Matt LaFleur's made no bones about wanting 3 running backs in his room. So I think James White could make some sense. An outside the box type of guy, and it has to be a little bit of a cheaper deal, would be Jerick McKinnon, former Viking, former 49er, coming from that Kyle Shanahan offense. Remember, had the injuries, played last year, actually played well in limited snaps. I could see him being a number 3 option, probably after the draft if maybe you don't get a running back as a number 3 guy at some point in the draft. Again, has to be like a 1-year vet minimum or a little bit more type deal, maybe with some incentives, but he knows that type of system. Hasn't been a great pass protector, but another player who's very effective catching the ball out of the backfield. Wide receiver, these are going to be some really sexy names you're absolutely going to love. Number 1 is Mac Hollins, and as you look at the back end of that wide receiver group, you want players that can really be effective special teams players. And Mac Hollins is one of the best special teams players at the wide receiver position in all of the league. He also still has some upside, former 4th round pick. He's very physical, tall, very, very good run blocker. Does this not sound like a type of player that Matt LaFleur would love? And he actually has some athleticism as well. So back end of the roster, wide receiver, camp body, who could actually make a team ball out on special teams, be a great run blocker, and actually be an effective catcher. If you like Jake Kumaro, this is kind of a Jake Kumaro type of player as a receiver who can run block and also play much better special teams than what Kumaro was. And then like an Isaiah McKenzie, somebody for the Bills. I think he had 1 punt return last year and went 82 yards for a touchdown. And, he's like 5'8", 5'9", super jittery, very athletic and speedy, tough to take down or tough to catch in the open field more than take down. But if they were interested in Tavon Austin last year in that role, in that kind of gadget, shifty wide receiver role, somebody who could play some punt return snaps, to me, Isaiah McKenzie's a better version of that, younger, faster, still in the prime of his career, whatever the prime of an Isaiah McKenzie career looks like, but he could be a player that makes some sense as well. Tight end, Mercedes Lewis still easily makes the most sense here and is the most realistic. But if for some reason he's not back or Green Bay just wants to go in a slightly different direction, Darren Fells, who the Texans just cut, really interesting option. He's actually been a pretty darn good receiving tight end, still like 6'7", 270, very similar type of bigger build as a Mercedes Lewis, better run blocker than you'd think he would be. Not to the level of a Mercedes Lewis, but definitely better than most tight ends in the league. Again, great size, and again, a much better receiving tight end than a Mercedes Mercedes Lewis. So I think you could actually make an argument that if Fells and Lewis were around the same price, that Fells might actually be a better overall option within your offense. I think everyone wants Mercedes Lewis back, and I still see that happening, but Fells could be an interesting fallback option if something falls through with Mercedes Lewis. Offensive tackle, Dennis Kelly, former Tennessee Titan, played in the offense with Matt LaFleur, would be able to be a plug-and-play guy right away. He's played left tackle, right tackle. This is an ideal swing tackle. I would argue very similar to a Rick Wagner, maybe even a little bit better, because Kelly can legitimately play left or right tackle. Wagner really struggled when he tried left tackle a season ago. But this is literally one of my favorite potential signings for Green Bay through the remainder of this offseason because, first of all, you could probably start him at left tackle, or you could start Billy Turner at left tackle and put Kelly at right tackle before, David Bakhtiari comes back from injury. But then even when Bakhtiari's back from injury, if he's at left tackle, now you have a legitimate starting right tackle in Kelly. And if you need to kick, Billy Turner inside for any reason, you could do that. It's just so much depth and versatility there. It's another player that can play either side. I don't think he's much of a guard option, but because Jenkins and Patrick and Billy Turner and all those guys inside have so much versatility, I don't think you need that much versatility. But the fact that Kelly is a legitimate starting player in this league, can play left or right tackle, really interesting option for Green Bay. And again, he knows Matt LaFleur's system. Ton of value there. An outside the box type of guy, Julian Davenport, former 4th round pick, has had a cup of coffee starting in this league. High athleticism, high traits, a little bit of a bigger guy, but somebody that I think could be a developmental player and could, if you get him cheap, could be somebody that competes in camp and could maybe even make a spot start here or there, battle it out with a Yash Nijman for that type of, that depth piece along the offensive line. He could be somebody else that makes sense. On the interior of the offensive line, again, Lane Taylor here, not breaking any news. I still think he makes a ton of sense, has left guard, right guard versatility. He's even kicked out to left tackle and started there. I just think that this is, he makes more sense with Green Bay than anywhere else. I know he's been injured the last 2 seasons, but Lane Taylor on a vet minimum just still seems to make way too much sense. And then another option is Michael Schofield. And maybe the biggest issue with Michael Schofield is he's not super great at the sport of football, which would seem to be a problem. But he has logged, I want to say almost close to 5,000 snaps in this league as a starter, all along the offensive line, tackle, guard, great versatility. I hesitate to use this because I think he's better than this player, but not all that dissimilar from like a Don Barclay who, again, has the left tackle, left guard, right tackle. We know Green Bay loves that type of versatility. Again, has logged a ton of snaps in this league. Somebody that if you need a spot start, you can get by with and is like the perfect 7th or 8th offensive lineman that's active on game day where you can just fill in at any position in an emergency type of situation. So somebody like that could certainly make sense. Along the defensive line, Lawrence Guy, former Green Bay Packer, 7th round draft pick, cut before or at the end of camp, signs with the Patriots, goes on and has a really fairly illustrious career in New England. It wasn't quite as good last year, but Green Bay needs physical, run-stopping defensive linemen. Lawrence Guy would make a ton of sense in a reunion in that scenario. And then Daquan Jones, former nose tackle for the Tennessee Titans, again, played in Tennessee while Matt LaFleur was there. Totally different sides of the ball, but you would assume they at least shook hands at least once, but could make some sense. More of a big physical, run-stopping defensive nose tackle. Again, if you're interested in a Snacks Harrison last year, something like that, Daquan Jones a little bit younger and provides a little bit more of a pass rush than a Snacks Harrison does as well. Edge rusher was really, really difficult, and I'm not enamored with either of these options, and I'm not going to spend too much time on them, to be frank. Trent Murphy could make some sense, played in Washington while Joe Barry was there, reunited with Preston Smith. As a flyer option, as a depth piece, maybe. I don't really see it, to be totally honest, but they could take a flyer there as a vet minimum with some incentives type of deal. And then again, I've gone over this before, and again, I don't like this idea, but they need somebody that can help cover a little bit more. Preston Smith wasn't good in that role last year. You don't want Gary or Zadarius Smith covering, so bringing back a player like Kyler Fackrell who can rush the passer a bit and actually drop back into coverage as your 4th outside linebacker. It's not the worst idea in the world. I don't see them going in that direction, and I don't love it, but there's not many names at edge rusher that make a ton of sense at this point. Inside linebacker, I'm actually going to go outside the box here, and I mentioned this the other day. Kenny Vaccaro is a name. Again, played for Tennessee while Matt LaFleur was there. Really interesting name. I think if he's a safety, I just don't think he can cut it as a coverage player, but I think you move him to linebacker. The Dallas Cowboys just signed Keanu Neal, former Falcon safety, as a full-time linebacker. I think if you move Vaccaro to linebacker full-time, play him in that Raven Green role, I think he can actually be better. He's been durable for the most part throughout his career, and I think he can be a really good run stopper and have some of that athleticism. That would be somebody that I'd be really interested in. And then I've mentioned this name before, Dylan Cole, Houston Texans. 2 years ago, he was starting to really develop into a sub-packaged linebacker and special team star for the Texans. Tore his ACL, just came back a season ago, still super young, super twitched up and freak athlete. I think he was like a 10 RAS guy for a RAS guy for Kent Lee Platty. Definitely somebody in, now back from his ACL injury that I could see making some sense as, again, minimum type of guy. Corner, I've discussed quite a bit over the last couple days. I mentioned Quentin Dunbar as somebody that could make sense, and I just went over yesterday Kevin King, how maybe Green Bay would bring him back. So those are two more realistic options over the course of the next couple weeks or so if Green Bay wants to go in one of those two directions. Of course, there's a Casey Hayward out there. By now, you know all the names that are available at cornerback. You probably have your own flavor that you like, so choose your own adventure on that one. And then last but not least, at safety, Xavier Woods, the safety for Dallas. I still think he has some upside. I think that was just a nightmare of a defense for Dallas, and I think he can be a lot better than what he played a season ago. So I'd be interested in him. I think he could be a perfect number 3 safety behind Adrian Amos and Darnell Savage. And then just another player, DeAndre Houston Carson. If Green Bay wants to be serious about their special teams, they have to sign players who are good at special teams. DeAndre Houston Carson for the Bears is one of those. He was in the top 10 last year in special team snaps logged, very good at it, and played on just about every special teams imaginable, kick return, punt coverage, kick coverage, field goal block. I mean, you name it, he was on it. So he would be somebody who could come in and potentially even be like Mason Crosby's going to be the special teams captain, but you know what I mean, that type of player who's on every special teams and isn't that terrible as like a number 4, number 5 safety if you need him in that situation as well. So a lot of potential names, none of them super sexy. None of them are probably the player that gets you from the NFC Championship game into the Super Bowl, but some players that could provide some much needed depth, special teams value, or just fill a hole that maybe Green Bay has in their roster right now. Thanks for listening. Appreciate you as always. Make sure to check out today's audio version of the podcast. Subscribe if you haven't already. But until next time, and as always, go Pack Go.